It's Sunday morning here in the car. You might not be watching this on Sunday morning, but it's a Sunday morning vibe where I am. We'll actually get more into that, I think, in a way, with the excerpt I'm going to read today. And I thought I would discuss today. First, I was thinking about having Sunday morning talks with Joel Goldsmith, as we've done before. A nice little spiritual something for you to contemplate. But I decided against that and really went the other direction with the book I brought to the car today. But all this stuff links together, as we always say. All these various manifesting creative, spiritual, psychological ideas, if we allow them to, in my opinion, they link together very nicely. And one thing I think we do on this channel that you don't see many other places is acknowledge that a lot of these popular law of assumption, law of attraction ideas don't have to be interpreted or applied even in this incredibly dramatic way. There's nothing wrong with a dramatic approach to manifesting, and I'll go over a little bit what that means in a second. There's nothing wrong with that, but there is something wrong when people assume the only way to manifest something in their life is by doing something kind of dramatic, like a dramatic technique. And by dramatic, I mean something like basically all the stuff Neville talks about. Neville, as we've gone over, was a dancer and a performer. He was incredibly theatrical, incredibly dramatic, which is a great thing, wonderful thing. But as Israel Regardie noted in his essay on Neville, and I'll put a link above to the video where we explore that essay in depth, Neville's whole approach was essentially dependent on this dramatism, this theatricality. And people that could evoke this kind of dramatic technique that he advocated for, SATS essentially, feeling as if, really feeling it as if, right? Those who were able to do that, are able to do that, have success with his technique. But if you can't do that, an approach like Neville's is usually going to be unsuccessful. And even people who are able to evoke this kind of dramatic feeling of something real, because they are theatrical and dramatic, often might find that they're unable to do it consistently. In other words, they're able to manifest some things that way, but they're unable to manifest everything they want in such a way. And so how this is presented often on places like YouTube is that this dramatic approach, and Abraham Hicks, for instance, obviously, I'm trying to think of popular examples. Abraham Hicks can be very dramatic too, right? This dramatic approach often seems difficult, as I just said, to evoke, to feel something as if, to really stay high vibe, for instance, to maintain that high state. And so because so many people are only exposed to these manifesting ideas and these ideas to improve your life in this way, they think that's the only way to do it. And then they assume they're failing because they're unable to sustain this kind of dramatic approach in their life in the way they want. While the reality, in my experience and working with many others and reading the history of this stuff, is that the dramatic approach that people like Neville advocate for, and that many of these other law of attraction, law of assumption type teachers advocate for, is simply one approach. And we can look at this stuff much more sober-mindedly and still get fantastic changes in our life over time, maybe quickly, maybe gradually, by using a much more sober, non-dramatic approach. And this sober approach is not, from what I've seen, discussed nearly as much, and most people still don't really know it exists. A popular example of it, which we often touch upon, is like the Sammy Ingram style robotic affirming, where you say something over and over again. When you're saying something over and over and over and over and over again, you're not necessarily going to feel as if. You're not necessarily going to feel high vibe. But you nonetheless just keep on going, saying something over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And the idea is gradually your mind gets filled with this idea so much, even though you're not evoking it in a really like dramatic way, your mind gets filled with this idea so much that imaginatively it starts to hold. And then you see it into your reality. Now, this, Sammy's approach, robotic affirming, is something that has probably always been used by humans, but it's in line with a lot of the stuff that Emile Coué talks about, which also I would say is generally a non-dramatic approach. And we're going to discuss a little bit more about Coué's approach and suggestion in general in a couple minutes. But it's much less dramatic when you're not trying to stay high vibe or assume the state and are just like, I'm going to get something. This is going to happen. Or you can say this has already happened, if that makes you feel better and more expectant of it happening in your 3D. Another good example of like a less dramatic approach is the stuff that Maxwell Maltz often talks about in psychocybernetics. Maltz always talked about how you have a goal and you just keep on trying to get it. And you fail and you course correct and you keep on trying to get it. And you use all these great imaginative tools that these other LOA teachers talk about. It's just, the idea is you just do something until you get it. So Maltz in psychocybernetics, he takes a lot of the drama out of the process, which is going to be hugely helpful for a lot of people. If you haven't checked out psychocybernetics, I would really suggest doing that for a lot of people who find that like this very dramatic approach doesn't work for them. I'll put a link above to a podcast episode where I just talk about how, if you are familiar with like the visualization techniques, SATs, that Neville talks about, if you then incorporate some of the stuff that Maltz talks about in psychocybernetics, it's going to make everything easier probably for you. But if we want to get really sober, which is what I often like to do, is take the drama out of things to deflate the balloon. We can go back to a more psychological approach to this stuff. And we can look at the stuff that Coué talked about and that a lot of other people interested in psychology and hypnotism at the turn of the 20th century and the early part of the 20th century were talking about in regards to suggestion. And we can just look at this idea of changing our life to improve our life through our imagination in this more sober way. Because the truth of the matter is we are always suggesting things to ourselves. We are always suggesting things to ourselves. You can't help but to be manifesting. Life is a continual manifestation. And, what you continually suggest to yourself, regularly suggest to yourself, and accept as being true, tends to shape your outer reality. This doesn't have to be some like super dramatic thing or some theory where we throw God into the mix and all these metaphysical terms and, whatever. This can simply be like, let's look at this psychologically and observe what we are suggesting to ourselves. And if we don't like what we're suggesting to ourselves, and almost all of us, if not all of us, suggest a bunch of crap to ourselves every day. If we're just being honest, I'm sorry, but it is what it is. We suggest a lot of crap to ourselves, right? And if we don't like a lot of the things we suggest to ourselves, we can work on suggesting more good things to ourselves instead. And being less reactive to all the negative suggestions that we make. Coué was very sober about this. Charles Baudouin in his book Suggestion and Autosuggestion is even more sober. We've talked about this book several times in the last few months. most people have never even really gotten into Coué. It goes without saying, if you're watching this channel, I suggest reading everything that Coué wrote or that was written about him. And that includes Suggestion and Autosuggestion by Charles Baudouin. I'll put a link below to the book. This book is not easy to read. It's not easy to read. He uses a lot of technical terms. He uses some antiquated terms. He's giving examples from the mid-19th century a lot of the time. But I gotta tell you, so what? Doesn't matter. It's a masterpiece. And it's one of the more sober assessments and examples of someone looking at these ideas of suggestibility and imagination and manifesting in just a very straightforward, this is kind of how it is way. And you look at it and you're like, holy shit, we don't understand how our mind works. Our mind does so many wild things that modern science, might kind of acknowledge, but doesn't really want to acknowledge, or just doesn't talk about, or has forgotten. Our mind does so many wild things, is so prone to suggestibility, that we really should perhaps be looking at our life differently and how we go about our life. One of the things that Baudouin talks about in here, and again, this book is so good. One of the things he talks about in here is like sentiment. And this circles back to like Neville was an artist and very theatrical. And a lot of people who get into Neville stuff and the popular LOA stuff are very theatrical. And they're like, oh, I've shifted states, like I've shifted into a new reality. And the more they do that, the more sentimental they get about it in a good way for them, if they've shifted effectively, you could say. But it's this very dramatic approach. And that dramatic approach is something that's just part of human life, you would say. Our sentiments, for good and bad, shape how we live. And a lot of our sentimentality is just manufactured. It's manufactured by, the music we listen to, the movies we watch, the social media we consume. And a lot of our sentiments are just crap. They're negative. They're negative suggestions as opposed to positive suggestions. Anyway, here's a quote from Suggestion and Autosuggestion. This is from the chapter Affective Suggestions. Affective Suggestions, I should say. This is going to be long, I think. Whatever. If you're following this, you're into this stuff. So, it's okay, it's long. Baudouin wrote, "It is obvious that in many instances the artist intensifies his own sentiment by the mere fact of expressing it. A poem is begun in a comparatively indifferent emotional state, but by the time he reaches the third or fourth stanza, the writer's eyes are moist. Sometimes the opening stanzas will merely have served to suggest a livelier sentiment to the author, and in the final revision of the poem, they will be suppressed because they seem weak and spiritless in comparison with those that follow, although they pave the way for these. The musician's prelude, the painter's study, have a similar preparatory role. Sometimes when the work of expression is finished, it comes to exercise the strongest suggestive power on the writer. There are verses of mine which I wrote without weeping, yet now on rereading they move me to tears. We are told that Nietzsche, rereading his own Zarathustra, was so strongly moved that he was unable to finish the book. The domain of art furnishes us with other examples of spontaneous suggestion. I refer to the suggestions which control public appreciation, whether favorable or unfavorable. People are guided by the critics, by fashion, by the comments of the catalog they glance at in front of every picture to learn what they ought to feel about it. Quite common is a horror of anything that is new in style, a dislike for any work that has not been consecrated as a masterpiece. But when this consecration has taken place, people will admire it with a fervor equal to that which they have previously despised. In others, we observe a tendency to rush after every novelty, a fondness for the ultra-futurist. Thus, some find a work beautiful and touching in proportion as it is in conformity with the established canons and is like everything else, whilst others admire a work and are moved by it in proportion as it is unlike everything else. And apart from a few humbugs, the public is in either case perfectly sincere. There have been epidemics of despair, epidemics of suicide, but another thing which shows clearly the extent to which sentiments are spread by suggestion and the way in which they affect human collectivities is the existence of a typical sentimentalism in each epoch. When a sentiment is genuinely original, when it is the true reflection of the individual's personal reactions, it naturally differs in persons of different temperaments. On the other hand, today, no less than in former times, similar varieties of temperament must exist, and these must react in similar ways. But human beings living in intimate association react in an almost uniform manner. And the general manifestations of sentiment differ from age to age. Romanticism was a collective crisis. It dominated sentiment for many years and then gave place to a new type of feeling. Such phenomena are not wholly explicable by historical happenings or by changes in social conditions. We must rather say that the sensibility of one person or of a few arouses widespread suggestive imitation. And it has often been pointed out that the whole Romanticist movement existed by anticipation of Rousseau. In like manner, the sensibility of our own epoch, in certain circles at least, is the outcomes of strong doses of Nietzschean suggestion, more or less distorted. We do not allege that everything can be explained by suggestion. We merely wish to reveal its presence and to demonstrate its power. Why is one model chosen in preference to another? The reasons for such a preference are doubtless complex, but as far as the present argument is concerned, the important point is that people do choose a model and imitate that model without fully realizing that they are doing so. As Bernheim phrased it, suggestion is not everything, but in everything there is a suggestive element. That's wicked fucking deep. Sunday mornings with Tim. No Goldsmith today. There's if we don't want to be dramatic, or if we find it like a dramatic application of these ideas, these manifesting ideas, doesn't work for us, you don't have to be dramatic at all. You can look at the stuff as soberly as Baudouin just did here and apply it into your life. You just think, man, what am I suggesting to myself? What am I suggesting to myself? How can I shift this? And doing that's very powerful. And there are a ton of different ways to do that based upon your sensibility and what works for you. If you want personal help from me, I gladly will support you in doing this through, coaching and counseling. And, these many videos on this channel hopefully help you do this as well. So I'm here for support if you need it. And if you're new here, if you've never watched a video before, and I have no idea why this would have been the first video of mine you've watched, I don't respond to comments on YouTube. But if you want to talk to me, you can contact me via email at info@radicalcounselor.com, and I'll email with you or provide you a short phone consultation if I can be a help. So I hope this long, winding, informative video made it more clear to you that suggestion is an inherent part of human life. And as Bernheim phrased it, it's not everything, but in everything there is a suggestive